Sarah Blakely cut the feet off a pair of control-top pantyhose in her apartment in 2000, slid them under a pair of white pants, and walked into a party feeling, for the first time in her adult life, like her clothes fit the way they were supposed to. She had $4,000 in savings, no fashion industry experience, no contacts, and a day job selling fax machines door to door across Florida that she had taken specifically because most people quit within a week, leaving her territory wide open. 5 years later, Spanx generated over $400 million in annual revenue. Within 7 years of that party, Blakely's personal fortune had crossed the threshold most people spend their entire working lives approaching and never reach. The story usually stops there, at the number, because the number is the part that sells. The part that actually explains the number is what was happening inside her decision-making in the years nobody was filming. Most accounts of rapid wealth creation default to one of two competing explanations, both flattering in their own direction and both, on close inspection, almost useless as a map for anyone trying to understand the mechanism. The first explanation is luck, the right idea at the right moment, a market gap nobody else happened to notice in time. The second is genius, superior intelligence, superior vision, a mind built differently from the start. Neither explanation survives contact with the actual research on rapid wealth creation, because both treat the outcome as the interesting variable. The outcome was never the interesting variable. The decision architecture that produced it, repeatedly, under pressure, across years of compounding small choices, is where the actual mechanism lies. Angela Duckworth's research at the University of Pennsylvania, formalized in her work on what she termed grit, found something specific enough to be useful. Across multiple domains, from military academy attrition rates to spelling bee outcome to sales performance, a combination of sustained passion and sustained perseverance toward long-term goals predicted success more reliably than raw talent measures or intelligence scores. The finding that mattered most wasn't that effort beats talent in some inspirational, poster-on-a-wall sense. It was that the people who built outsized outcomes had restructured their relationship with failure into something almost unrecognizable to a typical risk-averse nervous system. Blakely's father famously asked her and her brother, at the dinner table, not what they had succeeded at that week, but what they had failed at, and expressed visible disappointment when the answer was nothing. By the time she pitched her idea to 7 different patent attorneys, all of whom turned her down or quoted fees she couldn't afford, she had already spent a childhood treating rejection as data rather than verdict. This is the invisible architecture sitting underneath every account of rapid wealth creation that looks, from the outside, like a sudden leap. The leap was preceded by hundreds of smaller, unglamorous failures that recalibrated what failure was even allowed to mean to the person experiencing it. Picture the specific texture of one of those early failures, because the abstraction hide how physically uncomfortable the process actually was. A small hosiery mill in North Carolina, fluorescent light buzzing overhead, the smell of nylon and machine oil thick in the air, a factory owner shaking his head at a young woman's prototype for the 3rd time that month, explaining again why it couldn't be manufactured the way she wanted. She had driven 6 hours for that meeting. She would drive back, alone, with nothing, and call a different mill the following week. This is the part the eventual success story compresses into a single sentence. She faced rejection from manufacturers when the lived experience was a year of exactly this room, exactly this fluorescent hum, exactly this drive home, repeated until one mill owner's daughter read the product description aloud to her own father and convinced him to take the meeting seriously. Carol Dweck's research on mindset, developed across decades of controlled studies with both children and adults, identified the mechanism underneath this kind of sustained tolerance for repeated failure with more precision than grit alone explains. Dweck found that people operating from what she termed a growth mindset, the belief that ability and intelligence are developable rather than fixed, interpreted failure fundamentally differently from people operating from a fixed mindset. A fixed mindset subject, told they had performed poorly on a task, tended to disengage, protecting a self-image built on innate ability. A growth mindset subject, given identical negative feedback, tended to seek harder problems immediately afterward, treating the failure as information about strategy rather than information about identity. This distinction explains something counterintuitive about people who build wealth quickly. They are not, on average, more naturally talented than people who don't. They have simply organized their identity in a way that makes failure cheap to absorb and expensive to avoid, rather than the reverse, which is the dominant configuration in most people, for reasons with their own deep evolutionary logic. Since a damaged reputation within a small ancestral band carried genuine survival costs that a damaged business pitch in a modern economy does not actually carry, however much it might feel that way in the room. This reframes the 7-year timeline in a way the headline number obscures completely. Compounding, in finance, describes how a return generates further returns on an expanding base, accelerating with time in a curve that looks unremarkable for years, and then suddenly, visually, does not. The same mathematical shape governs skill and decision quality, not just capital. A founder's first year of decisions is made with the least available information, the least pattern recognition, the least calibrated intuition about which problems matter and which are noise. Year 5's decisions are made by someone who has already absorbed hundreds of small corrections, invisible to anyone watching from outside. The wealth curve that looks like a sudden leap in year 6 or 7 is not sudden at all. It is the visible eruption of a compounding process that was running quietly beneath the surface for every year that preceded it, exactly the way a chart of compound interest looks flat for a deceptively long stretch before the curve appears to bend upward all at once, even though the underlying rate never changed. There is a colder mechanism running alongside the growth mindset architecture, one finance researchers have studied with less sentimentality: asymmetric bet construction. Nassim Nicholas Taleb's work on what he termed antifragility identified a specific structural pattern present in most outsized financial outcomes, positions designed so that potential losses are capped and survivable, while potential gains remain open-ended and unbounded. Blakely's initial financial exposure was capped near the $4,000 in her savings account, and the unpaid hours she spent perfecting the product on nights and weekends, while still working her day job selling fax machines. The downside, if the idea failed completely, was a depleted savings account and a continued sales career she already understood how to perform. The upside had no comparable ceiling. This asymmetry is the actual mechanical explanation for why rapid wealth creation so rarely resembles reckless gambling, despite how it gets described after the fact by people who only see the outcome. The people who build outsized results are not, typically, taking the largest possible risks. They are taking the most asymmetric ones, structuring exposure so that a string of failures costs little and a single success pays disproportionately, then deliberately exposing themselves to enough opportunities for that asymmetry to play out across a long enough timeline for the math to actually resolve in their favor. Here is where conventional wisdom about wealth and personality gets the diagnosis backward most severely. The common assumption treats rapid wealth creation as evidence of exceptional risk tolerance, a special class of person willing to gamble where others play it safe. The research suggests something closer to the opposite. What looks like risk tolerance from the outside is frequently asymmetric structuring, combined with an unusually low cost assigned to failure itself, which makes the same bet feel like a far smaller risk to the person taking it than it appears to anyone watching. A person for whom failure carries catastrophic identity cost will rationally avoid the exact bets that someone with cheap failure tolerance will rationally take, even when the external numbers describing the bet are identical for both of them. The difference isn't courage. It's internal accounting, calibrated years before the specific bet ever presented itself. There's a further layer the public narrative almost always strips out entirely: control over what gets measured. Blakely manufactured her own product samples for over a year, controlled her own patent filing by reading patent law directly rather than hiring an attorney she couldn't yet afford, and personally pitched buyers at Neiman Marcus rather than delegating the pitch to a sales team she didn't have. This wasn't romantic bootstrapping for its own sake. It was a deliberate refusal to outsource the feedback loop to anyone whose incentives diverged from getting the product genuinely right. Every founder who built rapid wealth through this kind of compressed timeline shares this pattern far more reliably than they share any particular industry, market, or starting capital amount, an unusually tight loop between action, result, and adjustment, with almost nothing absorbing or distorting the signal in between. Most organizational structures exist, functionally, to insulate decision makers from the direct consequences of their own choices: layers of management, delegated feedback, filtered reporting. The 7-year compressed timeline requires dismantling that insulation deliberately, accepting the discomfort of unfiltered feedback in exchange for a learning rate that an insulated decision maker simply cannot match, no matter how intelligent they are. The leverage here is structural rather than inspirational, and stating it as inspiration would betray the actual mechanism. The lesson is not "believe in yourself" or "never give up," phrases too vague to redirect a single real decision. The lesson is threefold and specific. Assign failure a cost cheap enough to survive repeatedly rather than catastrophic enough to avoid entirely. Structure exposure so the downside is capped and the upside is not, rather than symmetrical gambling dressed up as boldness. And keep the feedback loop between decision and consequence as short and unfiltered as possible, for as long as possible, even when delegation would be more comfortable. None of these require unusual talent. All three require deliberately rejecting the more comfortable, more socially rewarded alternative at dozens of small decision points most people never notice they're making. There is one final piece of the mechanism worth sitting with, because it cuts against the triumphant tone these stories usually adopt. The compounding curve that produced Blakely's 7-year outcome was running on the exact same mathematics that, for someone with a slightly different starting structure, an uncapped downside, or an identity too fragile to survive the early failures, would have compounded just as relentlessly in the opposite direction. The mechanism itself is morally neutral. It rewards the structure of the bet and the cost assigned to failure, not the virtue of the person making it. This is the uncomfortable core Machiavelli would have recognized instantly. The system does not care whether the person inside it is admirable. It only registers whether the structure they built around their own decisions was sound. Blakely still has the original prototype somewhere, the cut-off pantyhose that started the entire compounding curve, kept not as a trophy but, by her own description, as a reminder of exactly how little the starting position required and exactly how much the years afterward did. The $4,000 was never the interesting number. It was simply small enough to risk completely, which is precisely what made everything that compounded on top of it possible to begin with.